So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this joint event of the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions and the Forum for Gender Law and Policy. It's a pleasure to host Professor Gila Stopler as we mark the publication of an important and timely book. So, Gila Stopler is a full professor of law from in the Law College of Law and Business. She's the former dean of the law school and the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Ethics of Human Rights. Her scholarship focuses on constitutional law, religion and state, women's rights, multiculturalism, and the challenges posed by populism and democratic backsliding. As you will see, they're all relevant for this book. The new book examines how the resurgence of patriarchal religion and right-wing populism has reshaped the legal and political landscape for women in liberal democracies. By exposing the deep roots of patriarchy within liberal theory and institutions, the book helped us to understand why attacks on women's rights have proven so effective politically and how they tie into the pressures on liberal democratic structures. We're also fortunate to have Professor Noya Lehmann, the head of the Forum for Gender Law and Policy, with us as a commentator. We want to thank you both for being here. Gila, the floor.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really grateful to the Minerva Center on the Rule of Law in Extreme Conditions and to the Forum for Gender Law and Policy for this invitation, to Professor Noya Lehmann for offering to comment on the book, and of course to all of you and everybody on the Zoom for joining us. Okay. So what I want to do in this talk is just to briefly introduce the main themes of the book, specifically of the readings, chapters, the introduction and the chapter 6. And I'll just start. So I understand that you just discussed this decision, so you'll hear about it some more from me. As many of you know, in June 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court issued the Dobbs decision, in which it basically eliminated the constitutional right to abortion with a devastating impact on the lives of tens of millions of American women. Now, the Dobbs majority based its decision on America's quote-unquote history and traditions, specifically on those existing at the time of the passage of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is 1868. And in applying these 1868 standards to women's rights, the court wasn't deterred at all by the knowledge that in 1868, American women had no legal personhood due to the rules of coverture, didn't have the right to vote. As Michelle Goodwin aptly explains when she analyzes the court's decision, the Dobbs Court's legal doctrine is no doctrine at all. And I quote, it consists of little more than a conservative political and religious judgment. Now, the Dobbs decision Okay, so the Dobbs decision is an excellent example of the toxic combination of patriarchy and religion, which I discuss in the book, and which affects women's rights in Western liberal states in the new millennium. Now, what I argue in the book is basically that first, patriarchy and patriarchal religion have always existed in liberal states, obviously have been partly accommodated by these states at the expense of women's rights. But second, the resurgence and the repoliticization of patriarchal religion in the 21st century have considerably magnified the threats facing women's rights in Western liberal states. Third, and moreover, the repoliticization of religion in the new millennium is often part and parcel of the rise of nationalism and of right-wing populism. Together, these phenomena threaten not only the rights of women, but the future of liberal democracy itself. In many countries, the calls to restrict women's rights have become the rallying cry for right-wing populists and religious conservatives in their surprisingly successful attack on the foundations of liberal democracy. Fourth, the success of the populist attack on women's rights, together with decisions such as those, has confirmed the feminist warnings regarding the flawed protection of women's rights in liberal societies, which have hitherto been routinely rejected by most liberals as unfounded and as alarmist. Fifth, and consequently, I claim that those of us who are interested in living in countries that have liberal democratic regimes must re-examine the foundations of liberalism to ensure that liberal theory and practice can protect both the rights of women and other minorities and the future of liberal democracies themselves. The book examines ways in which patriarchy is embedded in liberal theory, in law, and in practice, as well as in the dominant mainstream religions in liberal society. In the book, I expose how the enduring power of patriarchy in liberal societies is used by right-wing populists to advance their own cause, to restrict the rights of women, and to endanger the future of liberal democracy itself. The examination in the book is both conceptual and diachronic, and it centers on the ways that patriarchy and patriarchal religion are reflected in the liberal legal order in Western liberal states, with an emphasis on the US. I'll start by explaining the theoretical argument of the book, and then I'll move to the discussion of examples from the US and Israel. So, the theoretical argument starts with what is patriarchy. So according to contemporary feminist theory, patriarchy is a form of power. While the most common understanding of patriarchy today is as male dominance over women in society, patriarchy is much more than that. Feminist anthropologist Sherry Oakner explains, and I quote, "Patriarchy is more than just sexism. It is a social formation of male gender power with a particular structure that can be found with striking regularity in many different arenas of social life, from small-scale contexts like the family, kin groups, and gangs, up through larger institutional contexts like the police, the military, organized religion, the state, and more." End of quote. Now, according to sociologist Max Weber, which we all know, patriarchal domination is the purest form of traditional authority. It forms the basis of what Weber terms the patrimonial state. This form of traditional state authority has all but disappeared in liberal democracies in modernity until recently. In the last decades, there has been a political resurgence of patriarchy as a preferred social and political formation of power and authority through religious conservatism, through right-wing populism. And I claim that this resurgence in the drive to base state authority on patriarchal principles pose a threat both to women's rights and to the future of liberal democracy itself. Now, the reason why the opposition to women's rights and gender ideology has become an important engine of the right-wing populist revolution is that the basis for both is patriarchy. So now I want to move on to the linchpin of the argument in the book, which is the feminist critique of the public-private distinction. This distinction is, of course, foundational to liberalism and to its relationship with patriarchy and with religion. I claim that to understand the link between patriarchy and traditional forms of religion and their threat to liberalism and to women's rights, we need to go back to the 17th century and to the advent of liberalism. So what some would dismiss as antiquated of history, I think is in fact crucial to understanding the plight of liberal democracies today. In his classical patriarchal theory, which was liberalism's predecessor, Robert Filmer defended the patriarchal political rule of kings based on the argument that, and I quote, "the first kings were fathers of families," end of quote. Now, conversely, in his two treatises of government, John Locke rejected the political aspects and the political aspects of Filmer's theory, which were based on the religious patriarchal rule of the father. He offered instead the social contract theory, as the basis of liberalism, declaring that the basis of society is a contract between free and equal persons and that all men are entitled to political liberty and equality. However, and this is something which mainstream liberalism has ignored, as feminist scholar Carol Pateman astutely notes in her analysis of the relationship between patriarchy and liberalism, while liberalism rejected the political aspects of Filmer's theory, it simultaneously embraced the patriarchal subjugation of women to men, seeing it as natural and as belonging to the private, non-political sphere. Locke justified men's right to keep women subordinated in the private sphere while keeping the public sphere of freedom and equality for themselves based on the order of God and the laws of nature. So consequently, the liberal state has been structured around the political sphere of freedom and equality for men and the private sphere of patriarchal subjugation of women, which was viewed as natural and as non-political. Women's later entry into the public sphere has hardly changed this fundamental adherence of liberalism to the public-private distinction. Even many egalitarian liberals who insist that the foundational principle of liberalism is equality restrict equality to the public sphere. So, for example, Ronald Dworkin, while staunchly defending the principle of equality as the basis of liberalism, still insists that, and I quote, the liberal conception of equality is a principle of political organization by justice, not way of life for individuals, and liberals as such are indifferent as to whether people choose to behave as liberals are supposed to prefer. Now, I argue in the book that this form of political liberalism has never been capable of adequately facing the challenges of patriarchy and patriarchal religion and has never really wanted to. Therefore, although the advent of liberalism with its public-private distinction supposedly signaled the confinement of religion and its discriminatory aspects to the private sphere, patriarchal religion's power to subordinate women, to affect their status in both the public and the private sphere, has remained considerable. I describe this in the book, giving examples from various Western liberal countries. The result is that despite the universal promise of equality and freedom that liberalism gave, and of the separation between religion and the state, liberalism held very different consequences for men and women. Now, what is the scope of the public-private critique? One of the criticisms against the feminist critique of the public-private distinction is that the erasure of the distinction leads to totalitarianism. To quote Isaiah Berlin's famous words, and I quote, "There are frontiers not artificially drawn, within which men should be inviolable. These frontiers being defined in terms of rules so long and widely accepted that their observance has entered into the very conception of what it is to be a normal human being," end of quote. However, while the critique of the public-private distinction is central to the feminist critique of liberalism, most feminist critics do not call for the complete erasure of the public-private distinction. Rather, the critique contends that in a society in which gender hierarchy and sex discrimination exist, the public-private distinction is often used to perpetuate and to deepen them. As the feminist slogan, "The personal is political," aptly states, relegating patriarchy and patriarchal religion to the private sphere has neither depoliticized them, nor has it disempowered them. Quite to the contrary. Feminist legal theorist Frances Olson astutely points out that power holders in liberal societies gain legitimacy and immunity from attack, and the way to maintain the status quo in their own advantage by characterizing the power as private. So powerful patriarchal religious entities use their position in the private sphere to protect their own interests, to immunize their discriminatory actions against women from scrutiny and interference. Simultaneously, they characterize any power deployed against them as public and claim that it is unconstitutionally and unjustly oppressive towards them. So in this way, patriarchal religious entities use the public-private distinction both as a shield and as a sword to buttress their own power and to disempower women. I argue that this exploitation of the public-private distinction has facilitated the current rise of right-wing populism and of religious nationalism in what Arato and Cohen call the dark side of civil society. So now I want to turn to the critique of political liberalism in this context of the public-private distinction. So as many of you know, political liberalism is both the name of John Rawls' famous book introducing his most known political philosophy, but it also the political framework that most liberal states use in practice, which follows Rawls's principles. In the book in my book, I offer a detailed feminist critique of political liberalism. Here I don't have the ability to do that. I can only summarize the two fundamental errors that I claim political liberalism has done, how they have enabled the rise of right-wing populism. So political liberalism's first error is that it has for long allowed non-liberal and illiberal comprehensive doctrines to flourish and gain strength in liberal societies and use that strength in both the private and the public spheres to restrict the rights of women and of other disempowered groups. Political liberalism's second error is its naive and indeed misguided, I claim, assumption that citizens who adhere to non-liberal and illiberal comprehensive doctrines in their private lives will simultaneously develop a genuine commitment to a liberal political conception of justice. Now, the magnitude of this second error has only become fully apparent with the surprising success of right-wing populism, which is based on the strength of pre-existing non-liberal and illiberal groups that rally behind right-wing populism. When explaining why political liberalism is a viable theory, Rawls assumes that when citizens are faced with an incompatibility, and now I quote, between the political conception and their comprehensive doctrines, then they might very well, says Rawls, adjust or revise the latter, being their comprehensive doctrine, rather than reject the political conception. End of quote. Unfortunately, this expectation that illiberal doctrines would liberalize over time has been overly optimistic. There is no empirical evidence to back it. Quite to the contrary, the rise of right-wing populism and the repoliticization of religion, the ascent of religious nationalism, have made it clear that many adherents of illiberal comprehensive doctrines simply refuse to accept their relegation to the private sphere, and justly so from their own point of view. Now, I want to connect this to the question, how does right-wing populism succeed? Populism is ideologically thin. It relies on thick host ideologies. As a result, right-wing populism has proven to be a highly efficient tool for proto-authoritarian leaders, which enables them to unite different non-liberal and illiberal ideologies around two common denominators, which have proven to be devastating to liberal constitutional democracy. First, the classification of the liberal elite and its liberal causes, such as the protection of women's rights, as well as the rights of sexual minorities, racial minorities, immigrants, etc., as the common enemy of the true people. Second, the call to dismantle the liberal state's institutional framework, including courts, the professional civic service, etc., which is, according to the populist claim, the primary obstacle preventing the realization of the will of the true people. In the book, I discuss examples from Orban in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and mostly the example of the US, where the populist President Trump has aligned himself with powerful religious conservatives and Christian nationalists, whose support he gained, among other things, through promises to enact public policies narrowing the rights of women and other sexual minorities. Two striking examples that I discuss in the book are the two Supreme Court cases, Dobbs and the Texan Whole Women's Health case. I'll start with the Texan case, which is earlier, and move on to Dobbs, with which I began the talk. So, Whole Women's Health versus Jackson from 2021 arose because in 2021 the Texas legislature enacted the Texas Heartbeat Act, also known as SB 8, which prohibits abortion after 6 weeks, even in cases of rape, incest, or lethal fatal abnormality. Now, SB 8 was passed almost a year prior to the Dobbs decision, at the time when Roe v. Wade, which recognized the constitutional right to abortion, was still good law. So Texans had a problem, and to withstand a constitutional challenge, SB 8 is enforced exclusively through private civil action. It empowers any private person to bring a civil action against any person who performs or induces an abortion or aids and abets such performance or inducement, even where the claimant hasn't suffered any concrete injury and doesn't even know the person performing the abortion. Now, if the claimant prevails, the law instructs the court to award the claimant injunctive relief and statutory damages in the amount of no less than $10,000 for each abortion performed or induced in violation of the law. The U.S. Supreme Court, obviously this reached the U.S. Supreme Court and it allowed the law to stand. The majority had no qualms allowing private persons to act as bounty hunters and letting the religious and moral prejudices of individuals, even their plain greed, crush women's constitutional right to abortion, which was still protected then by Roe. The Texan law and the court's decision to allow it to stand demonstrate how the right-wing populist attack on liberal democratic rights and institutions utilizes the public-private distinction to weaken public institutions and to transfer their power to patriarchal religious private entities and individuals. So Texas has created a legal mechanism that enables private individual vigilantes to establish and enforce a patriarchal religious order that prevents abortion, that ensures high monetary awards to its private, self-appointed enforcers. As Justice Sotomayor explains in her dissent, and I quote, in effect, the Texas legislature has deputized the state's citizens as bounty hunters, offering them cash prizes for civilly prosecuting their neighbors' medical procedures. Taken together, the act is a breathtaking act of defiance of the Constitution, of this court's precedents, and of the rights of women seeking abortions throughout Texas. End of quote. Alarmingly, though not surprisingly, SB 8 is reminiscent of the 19th century laws allowing a husband to sue anyone who harbors, quote unquote, harbors and shelters his wife at her own request. This 19th century legislation referred to in Matilda Jocelyn Gage's 1893 book, Woman, Church, State, empowers the husband to privately prosecute people who assist his wife to escape from him. Another 18th and 19th century legislation that SB 8 closely resembles are the 1850 Fugitive Slave Acts, which deputized any private citizen to seize fugitive slaves and return them to their enslavers for a monetary award. It is striking to observe that just like in the 19th century, in the 2020s, once again, American law guided by patriarchal religious rationales empowers private individuals to deny women their autonomy and their right to control their bodies, and even enables citizens to profit from doing so. Now I want to move again to Dobbs. In 2022, as we already said, the court decided the Dobbs decision, which altogether eliminated the constitutional right to abortion. All the legal maneuvering that Texas had to do to bypass the right has become redundant. I've already discussed Dobbs, and I'm not going to repeat what I said, but I will add that the Dobbs majority, what it has in fact done is to rule that because patriarchal religious prejudice against women is an important part of American history and tradition, such religious prejudice must remain in place and continue to control women's lives and opportunities unless women succeed in changing the American Constitution. Now, we all know that changing the American Constitution is an almost impossible task. The failed attempt to pass the Equal Rights Amendment to secure women's right to equality has proven that. And in this manner, what the Supreme Court has done was, in fact, to elevate the right to enforce religious patriarchal prejudice against women to an American constitutional principle. This paves the way for the private patriarchal religious sphere to take control over the public sphere of the state and to establish Christian nationalism, its misogynist and racist principles as the foundation of the patrimonial state with the backing of the American Supreme Court. The Dobbs Court's decision to eliminate the constitutional right to abortion has created an unprecedented human rights crisis for women in the US. As of November 25, 12 states have enacted complete bans on abortion with very limited exception. 4 more have banned abortion starting at 6 weeks of pregnancy, in which many women do not even know that they're pregnant. Over a third of American women of reproductive age live in these states. Just like SB 8, the Dobbs decision and the abortion bans and restrictive abortion laws that, if constitutionalized, have a disproportionate impact on Black women, who are both more vulnerable to health risks in childbirth and less able to travel out of state to get an abortion elsewhere. Black women are the population that is most at risk to die due to pregnancy-related risks in the United States, and they're almost 4 times more likely to die due to maternal mortality than white women. But even more than that is at stake. While this signals a turning point in the takeover of the public sphere by patriarchal religious prejudice, it is by no means the end. So first, the elimination of the constitutional right to abortion may open the way to a recognition of a constitutional right of the life of the fetus, which will result in the abolition of legal abortion in the United States. Second, just like the right to abortion, the rights to contraception, to sexual intimacy, as well as the right to gay marriage, are all based on the court's substantive due process doctrine derived from the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, and are not part of what the court has found to be America's history and traditions. Therefore, they are subject to the exact same rationale that led to the annulment of the constitutional right to abortion. And third, and finally, the constitutional anchoring of women's equality in the US is also found in the 14th Amendment, albeit in the Equal Protection Clause. So when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, it was enacted with the rights of African American men in mind. None of the white men drafting the amendment imagined applying it to women. This is why the 2020 Roberts Court, in its ultra-conservative composition, may at any point decide that women do not have the constitutional right to equality because it's not part of America's history and traditions. And this would mean that when it comes to women, even this fundamental right would be left to the discretion of the majority in each state. So through a combination of right-wing populist and Christian nationalist tactics and ideology, the conservative movement has launched a very successful attack on American liberal democracy. Through a conservative controlled Supreme Court, American constitutional law has actually been transformed to allow the establishment of Christian religious patriarchy. In conservative states, rigged state legislatures, I talk in the book about why they're rigged. I don't think it's, I think it's common knowledge, but, and so these rigged state legislatures have been freed from the federal constitutional rights constraints and have been granted full control over women's bodies and their rights. Okay, so I'll stop here about the United States and I'll move quickly to Israel, okay? So I'll give some background about Israel for people who are not familiar. In certain aspects, especially in the matter of personal status, the State of Israel has, from its inception, sacrificed women's rights to equality at the altar of political considerations and the attempt to please patriarchal religious elements. Therefore, alongside considerable achievements in the struggle of women in Israel for equality over the years, islands of extreme inequality always remain. In the last 3 years, as part of the current government's war on women, the new coalition has undertaken to expand these islands and let extremist religious views and the rabbis who dictate them take over many aspects of the state's treatment of women and their rights. One of the areas around which there has been a furious struggle in the last 25 years is the segregation and exclusion of women in the public sphere due to religious reasons. In the late 1990s, for those of you who are not familiar with this, Israeli authorities have started to initiate the exclusion and segregation of women in various public spaces and services. The reasoning that was offered for this segregation and exclusion of women is to facilitate the integration of ultra-Orthodox Jews through the replication of the strict standards of sexual modesty practiced by them in their private sphere into the common public sphere. Supposedly, such replication will allow ultra-Orthodox individuals to integrate into the larger state society without abandoning their way of life and their customary practices. The exclusion and segregation of women in the public sphere is achieved by 3 methods. First, denying them some services entirely, exclusion. Second, by forbidding their presence in various places at the same time as men, segregation. Or third, by allowing their presence only as long as they dress and behave modestly. And while sex segregation was presumably intended to affect only members of the ultra-Orthodox community, it has inevitably had a significant effect on all users of the public sphere in Israel, as many of us know and have experienced, leading to the exclusion of all women from increasingly larger segments of the public sphere, and consequently to restrictions on their rights and on their equal opportunities. These include, for example, exclusion from positions in the army, from various employment opportunities, from various public services and cultural events, etc. This has generated heated opposition from feminists who have been working through the courts, in government, and in the legislature with mixed results. I do not have the time to go into these struggles. What I do want to note is that the feminist critique of the expanded exclusion of women on religious grounds has been perceived by many as a misguided critique that fails to recognize the supposed cultural right of the Haredim and of the religious Zionist hardliners, Hardalim, to lead a segregated lifestyle. Those criticizing the feminist struggle claim that segregation doesn't violate the rights of women in these communities who ostensibly agree to segregation, nor does it violate the rights of secular women who are allegedly not required to be in the segregated spaces. But here again, the profound error in this argument, in my view, and the true severity of the extent of women's exclusion and the takeover of patriarchal and discriminatory perceptions is revealed when one looks at the senior government echelon in Israel today. At this echelon, the transition to patriarchal rule by men has already taken place. It created by the current government's ministers who insist on appointing only men to senior positions in the public sphere, contrary to explicit law. Moreover, after the ministers of the current government appointed a minuscule number of women as directors general to government ministries, a petition was filed to the Israeli Supreme Court against the government for violating the duty of adequate representation, which all of us Israelis are aware of. The petition was accepted in February 2025, and the court ruled that the government was obliged to obey the provisions of the law. A very revolutionary decision. Despite this, the government continued to ignore the provisions of the law and the High Court ruling and continued to appoint only male directors general. And as of now, not a single woman serves as director general in any of the 31 government ministries. In the previous government, 39% of directors general of government ministries were women. In the current government, 0%. In this way, the exclusion of women from prominent centers of power in Haredi society, which was initially presented as an internal matter of the community, has become the norm in the centers of state power and has been fully carried out by all current government ministries and ministers, including the very few women ministers. This norm is consistent with the patrimonial regime that Netanyahu and his government seek to establish in Israel, in which religious patriarchy leaves the private sphere, takes over the public sphere as well, and becomes the organizing principle of the regime. To conclude, I love this. Okay, so the struggle between liberal, democratic, and religious populist forces in places such as the United States or Israel today is not just around the power of patriarchy to control women in the private sphere. What stands at the heart of this struggle is the religious conservative and right-wing populist effort to erase the boundary between the public and the private, dismantle the liberal state structure, and reinstate a traditional patriarchal political order as the basis for a patrimonial state. Obviously, such a patriarchal order is devastating to the rights of women, of sexual and racial minorities, of immigrants, etc., but also devastating to liberal democracy itself. Thank you.
So now it's my turn. So first I want to begin by congratulating Gila for this truly thought-provoking book. I truly recommend for those of you who haven't read it yet. In my comments today, I don't seek to challenge Gila's central claims. On the contrary, I agree with much of what she argues. So in the short time I have today, I would like to offer 4 comments that add further perspectives to the discussion on the current relationship between religion, liberalism, and patriarchy, comments that I hope supplement and strengthen Gila's arguments. My first comment is conceptual. Throughout the book, Gila refers to the rise of religious conservatism, adopting a term widely used in current scholarship to describe religious forces that have gained growing political influence. However, I would suggest replacing the term religious conservatives with religious fundamentalist, as the latter better captures, in my opinion, not only the nature of the forces that are driving democratic backsliding, but also the particular threats they pose to liberal rights and gender equality. Religious fundamentalism involves a strict, literal interpretation of sacred text and a belief in the absolute, unalterable truth. It often leads to dogmatism and extreme intolerance towards opposing viewpoints, which are seen as threats to the truth. For fundamentalists, their religion is beyond any form of criticism and must therefore be imposed upon others. Conservatism, by contrast, while often socially traditional and cautious about rapid change, is a broader political and social philosophy. It values inherited traditions and institutions without necessarily requiring literal interpretations of religious doctrine or a total rejection of modernity. The key distinction is that fundamentalism represents a more extreme, dogmatic, and militant subset of religiosity, one that cannot be equated with conservatism as a whole. To put it simply, not all conservatives are fundamentalist. And so, in my opinion, the term religious conservatives fail to capture the full significance of the current political moment and the depths of the threat to the liberal state and to gender equality. It masks the defining characteristics of religious fundamentalism, which are bigotry, zealotry, militancy, extremism, and fanaticism. Justice Alito and Justice Thomas of the US Supreme Court, for example, are not religious conservatives. They are religious fundamentalists. This more precise classification better illuminates their judicial reasoning and explains the often extreme and even violent implications of their decisions. Alito's majority opinion in Dobbs that Gila discussed is not merely a rejection of precedent. It is also a text that disregards the devastating real-world consequences of abortion bans for women's life and denies that such consequences should matter to the courts even when they cause immense suffering. Similarly, Justice Thomas's opinion in Bruin, the case striking down New York's requirement that individuals show proper cause to carry a concealed handgun in public, reveals a similar indifference to the human cost, disregarding the decision's consequences for escalating gun violence and mass shootings, as well as its impact on ordinary people's fundamental right to life. My proposed focus on religious fundamentalism as a distinct form of religious conservatism also illuminates the nature of the ultimate project that these forces seek to advance, and this brings me to my second comment. In her book, Professor Stopler rightly emphasizes that at the heart of the struggle waged by religious forces lies not only the preservation of patriarchal power in the private sphere, but also the patriarchal restructuring of the public sphere and the creation of the patrimonial state. I wish to add to this by suggesting that the precise objective of religious fundamentalist forces is to elevate religious liberty to the status of a super right, one whose protection is prioritized above and beyond other fundamental rights. Crucially, the goal is not to protect religious liberty of all religious views, but rather to enable the establishment of a single fundamentalist version of religion as the primary regulator of the public sphere. This underscores the true essence of the fundamentalist project exemplified by US Supreme Court justices such as Thomas and Alito. It is a reactionary enterprise aimed at undermining the existing constitutional order and replacing it with a new one, an order in which the anti-establishment clause becomes increasingly irrelevant and fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity emerge as a dominant force in shaping public life. A recent article by Adam Hamdan illustrates how these trends manifest in the court's jurisprudence. The article offers a statistical analysis of the role of religion in Supreme Court decisions. Hamdan finds that under the Roberts Court, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of religious groups, especially Christian groups, more frequently than its predecessors. The Roberts Court has also taken up a greater number of free exercise clause cases and issued consequential rulings on religious liberty at a significantly higher rate than earlier courts. Notably, Hamdan reports that in 2/3 of cases involving Christian groups, those groups prevailed, underscoring how the court's rulings actively assisted and align with efforts to impose a Christian nationalist worldview on the American public, practically erasing the anti-establishment clause. My third comment aims to further illuminate the central role that rights and rights-based discourse play in advancing the populist and fundamentalist project. Here, I want to expand on two of Gila's central claims. First, she argues that religious actors have been able to erode gender equality by appropriating and distorting the language of human rights. Second, she contends that liberal theory lacks a robust account of power and therefore fails to adequately recognize how religious and cultural institutions, practices, and norms operate as sites of social and political coercion. In one chapter of the book, and she already mentioned this, she examines the institutionalized expansion of religiously motivated gender segregation into new arenas of Israel's public sphere, highlighting the role of rights-based concepts such as religious liberty and the right to multicultural accommodation in legitimizing and justifying these developments. To underscore the significance of these claims, I suggest drawing on Riva Siegel's concept, preservation through transformation. Siegel introduced this framework in her work from the late 90s on the evolution of legal rules governing domestic violence. The concept describes a process through which gender hierarchies are maintained over time precisely through the ostensible enforcement of liberal principles and the rhetorical embrace of change. I believe Siegel's concept helps capture the troubling nature of the spread of gender segregation into new areas of Israel's public sphere, such as public transportation, the academia, and as Gila mentioned, now the army. In my own work on the role of law in facilitating this expansion, I show how liberal legislators and Supreme Court justices rely on multicultural rights discourse to sustain these practices. This reliance is particularly significant because, on its face, it appears to represent a progressive turn within liberal theory, a shift for an emphasis on individual rights to group rights, allegedly expanding the protective reach of liberal norms to cultural and religious minorities. However, following Siegel, this is in fact a process of preservation through transformation. What appears to be a progressive liberal advance ultimately obscures and thereby perpetuates a coercive and gender discriminatory dimensions of gender segregation. More precisely, it masks the fact that gender segregation in Orthodox Judaism is rooted in long-standing hierarchical assumptions about the distinct nature and qualities of men and women. These normative constructs justify the exclusion of women from position of religious authority and institutional leadership within ultra-Orthodox communities. Thus, when the liberal states provide infrastructural support or financial resources for gender-segregated practices, it reinforces a deeply hierarchical framework governing gender and gender relations. Moreover, the use of multiculturalism to facilitate the spread of gender segregation into additional public arenas carries another troubling implication in terms of power relations. It contributes to a monolithic portrayal of the ultra-Orthodox community as internally coherent and speaking with a single voice. This portrayal erases internal diversity, dissent, and internal power struggles over the interpretation of gender norms and the proper boundaries of gender segregation in the public sphere. Put differently, when the state endorses a strict interpretation of gender segregation in the name of accommodating the needs of the entire ultra-Orthodox community, it is in fact cooperating with the most conservative elements within the community and enabling them to impose their fundamentalist vision of gender segregation on all members of the community. Finally, we cannot discuss the current regression in gender equality without critically acknowledging the role that some women themselves play in reinforcing these dynamics. In my previous comment, I focused on the appropriation of liberal rights discourse to justify discriminatory practices against women. In this fourth and final comment, I want to turn to a related phenomenon, the misuse of the term feminism and its strategic adoption by ultra-conservative and populist forces. These actors are actively undermining the feminist agenda and the struggle for gender equality by reframing feminism as a patriarchal concept. The primary tool in this effort is the promotion of what they present as a new strain of feminism, conservative feminism, positioned as a declared corrective to the alleged failures of liberal feminism. A revealing example comes from a recent episode of Ross Dowdett's a podcast, Interesting Times. I don't know how many of you know him. He's a conservative Catholic commentator whose new show, sponsored by the New York Times, aims to explore the new right and other contemporary political realignments. In this recent episode, he hosted two women described as theorists to discuss the following question: did liberal feminism ruin the workplace? And is there a conservative feminism that can correct its mistakes? His first guest, Helen Andrews, recently published an essay titled The Great Feminization, in which she argues that women's large-scale entry into the workforce has feminized numerous professions. According to Andrews, this shift endangers the labor market because women's supposed prioritization of empathy over rationality, safety over risk, and cohesion over competition ultimately weakens institution and professional standards. The second guest, Leah Libresco-Sargent, has recently published a book titled The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. Under the guise of a new strain of feminism, and as part of the slogan advocating for women as women, she calls for celebrating women's distinct care-related and compassionate qualities that she ties to their biology, or more precisely, to their ability to become pregnant. Although Libresco-Sargent rejects Andrews' assertion that feminine traits are inherently inferior to masculine traits, she nevertheless similarly advances an essentialist rhetoric that reduces women's nature to their reproductive capacities. Moreover, she also identifies as a pro-life feminist, echoing a long tradition of anti-abortion movements led by women who appropriated the language of feminism to justify abortion bans that ultimately compel women to carry unwanted pregnancies to term. Historically, patriarchal structures sought to undermine feminist ideas by associating feminism with negative stereotypes such as militancy, radicalism, misandry, and the rejection of femininity. What we are witnessing today is a far more sophisticated campaign feminism has been seized by populist and religious fundamentalist actors who redefine it as a sexist ideology that affirms rather than challenges patriarchal norms. So as we chart the various threats to gender equality in this era of democratic backsliding, rising populism, and religious fundamentalism, we must recognize that the hostile takeover of feminism itself is an additional aspect of the contemporary assault on gender equality. Thank you.
Yeah, so I agree. I agree with Naya. First of all, thank you for an eye-opening comment. And, I agree with everything that you say, except for with regard to the first comment that not to use religious conservatives, but to use religious fundamentalism. So this is a tricky one. I mean, I agree with you that they're all fundamentalists, but in terms of political theory, there was a problem. I don't know if you know Gila Stopler. She's a feminist. She writes in political theory, but Rawls has, you know, in his liberalism, his political liberalism, he says, you know, religious fundamentalism has no place. We have to eradicate this, but he interprets religious fundamentalism basically to be just those very, you know, few people who will not recognize at all the existence of any other religion and will not, you know, according to his idea of what religious fundamentalism is, there are almost no religious fundamentalists, therefore they do not pose a real threat to liberal societies, therefore liberal societies can continue to act the way they act. Now, Stockholm she does a smart move. She says, look, what Rawls has missed is that between religious fundamentalism, the way he defines it, and you know, religious liberals, those who will change who will instead of you know, applying their comprehensive doctrines to the public sphere, will adopt political liberalism. Between these two groups, there is a very large group of what she calls religious traditionalists. Now, these religious traditionalists, what they share with religious fundamentalists is the rejection of egalitarian liberalism, the rejection of universal human rights, etc. But unlike fundamentalists, they don't do so openly, and they don't retreat from society and say, we don't want any business with anybody. They don't threaten to use violent means to overthrow the liberal regime. What they do instead is much more sophisticated, just like you said. What they do is use sophisticated means of transforming liberal society from within through liberal means, without saying that this is what they do, right? So, for example, the Orthodox, Christian Orthodox Russian church, which is her main case study. Christian nationalists in the United States. In Israel, you can allegedly say, you know, the Haredim, you could see some of them as fundamentalists, others as doing exactly that, using the political process to change from within without, you know, adopting the fundamentalist cloak which we're all used to see. So this is why I think it's important to you know, to spotlight the fact that those people who are, I agree with you that they're fundamentalists in terms of their end results, but they're not fundamentalists in terms of the means that they're using, and therefore they're masking themselves, and we should be aware of that, because, you know, the last 20 years have shown that this is exactly the process which we are facing, and which political liberalism has not. Rawls, when he wrote political liberalism, and liberal states, when they're implementing political liberalism, they don't know what to do with this type of procedure.
So thanks so much, Gila and Noya. We'll open it up.
Shall I? Okay. Thank you so much for fascinating and actually very persuasive presentation. I want briefly to defend John Locke for you, and also to say something about of the liberalism which hasn't been mentioned. So with regard to Locke, it's very important to know, and this is a kind of deep and Locke scholarship, but it has been pointed out that people allowed civic participation in the state, signatories to the social contract, state of which he comes in society, are not made. They are Protestant properties. And all of these conditions, which were so essential for Locke himself, were later easily removable from the liberal paradigm. So Catholics allowed in, unprotected, Jews, and lastly, women, but it is still the liberalism that we inherited from Locke. We haven't changed its name or his, sorry about the word paternity, because gender is not essential to the lines it is drawn. It is attributes, but not essential. What was essential was his total demolition of Robert Filmer's patriarchy. As important to note that his books were his second treatise were actually a response directly to Filmer, and the demolition of the patriarchal element within the theory of government. And that proved very useful for later on. We cannot blame the private versus public distinction with him, but he actually walks out of his inclined colors compared to others. If you want to be angry at a major liberal philosopher, please consider directing your anger at John Stuart Mill.
Immanuel Kant.
Immanuel Kant in a different way, but Mill on liberty and in discussing freedom of expression, created a magical thinking around liberalism that we still held. I think I still held much of my adult life. Magical thinking that in the so-called market of ideas, not Mill's metaphor, by the way, kind of retrospectively, but in free competition, liberal ideas would prevail. And this is now proven to be magical thinking, and we should prove that at Mill, and in a different way, I agree about Kant. Second point, very quickly, on the other side of the liberal playing field, we have progressivism, like neo-progressivism, which is the child of an array of critical theory, critiques of liberalism itself. But there too, what we are unfortunately witnessing in the last few years, and Saremu, in a way, is that certain elements, such as post-colonialism and identity theory, are defeating feminism on the other side of the scale. So that's not the conservative, but the so-called ultra-critical scale. Again, feminism is becoming a victim or else abducted into a totally hostile language. So I thought maybe you'd like also to note something about this.
Should I respond? First of all, thanks. This is really helpful. But I still think the public-private distinction is at the heart of both this phenomena. So the new progressivism does exactly, it just adopts the public-private distinction completely, saying, you have to give let all these poor groups do whatever they want to do because of, multiculturalism, decolonialism, whatever. So it's the whole idea that it's possible to have this kind of framework which still works, like a legal framework which still works, while allowing everybody to do whatever they want, which means to discriminate, to even burn people. As far as these new progressivists, when they think of whoever they support, whatever they can do because this is their culture or whatever. This whole idea is simply, it just doesn't work. But I still do think that Locke is responsible, at least in the sense that for him the private sphere was a sphere in which Filmer's principles of patriarchy and religion still continued as a natural law and etc. to exist, and because women were in this private sphere, I mean, it's not. It's like saying, don't accuse Locke because he didn't discriminate only against women; he also discriminated against men. that's not something which we should compliment him on. I believe so. I think that this doesn't weaken my point that this public-private distinction is extremely crucial to understanding why we are at the point we are, and the new progressivism is simply another result of exactly the same idea that you should allow private groups, private religious beliefs, etc., to do what they think is correct.
Daniel?
Hi, I'm Danielle Zaychik. I came with Minerva today, and I have a few comments, I guess. First of all, as someone who lives and sends her children and is actively involved with the Haredi community, I really object to the representation, how you represented the community. I think that it wouldn't detract from your point to use a little bit more objective language. Noya, I object even more to your representation, especially with regards to acquiescing to community demands as a way of silencing voices. I think that's it's just not accurate from what I see. A couple of my questions are I guess the point that I really I heard and resonated and I agreed with you on was the when you put up the Rawls slide and describe the pitfalls of liberal democracy, and the two ways in which you describe liberal democracy undermining itself. I didn't hear solutions though. I don't like I'm curious, like at the end of your presentation, what you suggest, because it seems to me that you get stuck on the practical solutions to balancing religious freedom with the preservation of a liberal democratic society, and like the devil's in the details here, because without like some solutions, like the only like things that I can think of are or limiting rights or brainwashing children. Like that was kind of but there must be other solutions here. I do wonder also about the measures for measuring the metrics used for measuring women's rights in different countries. Why in America everyone's stuck on women's rights being equivalent to abortion. I wonder, like in general, why that's the equivalent without having background in this topic. Why that? Because it's the discourse in liberal circles is, of course, that abortion is a women's rights issue, and the discourse in conservative circles is not so. It's not about a women's rights issue. It's about a life issue, and perhaps the framing is where the disconnect is there. I also wonder about the focus on. I understand why the focus on Haredi society in Israel is logical, but maybe also giving expression to conservative voices in Arab conservative circles is also important in this context. I I wonder if the conversation would look different if we're talking about respecting the religious preferences of Arab minorities, of conservative elements of the Arab minority. That's it.
So, first of all, thank you. I'm not sure, you said that I talked about silencing voices. I'm not sure, I don't.
She referred to
No,
me.
no, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay,
When I was talking,
okay.
there's no silences, internal dissents and disputes within the community.
Okay, so maybe you respond to that later, but yeah, because I didn't see myself as talking about that. Solutions. So I do have actually, my conclusion is the way forward. I'm not sure you're going to like my solutions, obviously. I do think that solutions in, I discussed, for example, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. In the book, CEDAW discusses the fact that we need to do, to have educational and other ways to terminate or to eliminate discrimination against women, all forms of traditional behavior that discriminates against women. Again, you may not think that this is something that we should do. I do believe this is something that we should do, and I also think that what is happening in the world today, what is happening in Israel, it's easy to say let the Haredi community do what the Haredi community wants. But the Haredi community, and I'm not talking about the community, I'm talking about the Haredi political leaders, they don't want just to let the Haredi community do what the Haredi community wants. They don't just want to, and I'm sorry if I'm blunt, they don't just want to discriminate against Haredi women. They don't just want power, absolute power over Haredi women. They want power, absolute power over all women in Israeli society. And they're actually achieving it. For example, as I show in with the issue of the general directors and the fact that we have the expansion of things that I didn't go into. Obviously, the expansion of the Batei Din and the authority of the religious courts, etc. So it's kind of. Again, I'm sorry if I'm offending, but it's kind of problematic on the one hand to accept, I'm talking in the context of Israel, I'll refer to the context of the United States in a second. On one hand, to accept the fact, that religious courts have an absolute right to enforce, an absolute authority to enforce religious law of marriage and divorce over secular women, and on the other, as though there's no need to change that, and on the other hand, to object to women coming, even secular women, like me, coming and saying there is a problem here with the way that a liberal democracy is treating minorities. By the way, I don't think that Israel is liberal democracy. It never was. It's at best semi-liberal democracy. Has been. No, it's not even that. So my critique is a critique of liberalism. Okay, I'm not saying that I think that the liberal solutions are good. Liberal solutions have brought us to this point, and this point is a very problematic point, a very serious point, a point in which women's rights are being violated, and in which all the principles of liberal democracy are in grave danger. Now, if in order to save those principles, we need to, in the tradition of defensive or militant democracy, we need to do things that we didn't do before. I certainly believe that we need to do them. So CEDAW, which has never been implemented, which the United States, for example, has not even signed, which Israel has signed, but with objections from here to wherever. If these things are not implemented, then obviously we're getting to the results that we see before us. Now you're asking, in the context of the United States, what are the metrics for measuring women's rights? Is abortion a woman's rights issue? So again, we have one of the interesting things that's happening today is that we do not have common language. So you can say, abortion is not women's rights. Let's move on to, let's discuss some other things. It's just like saying, in the Israeli context, and it is being said by many by many ultra-Orthodox politicians, being married being compelled to be married in a religious marriage is not a human rights issue. It's tradition. It's something that the state has the right to, to impose. So we do have a serious problem of agreeing on what human rights are, specifically what women's rights are, because women's rights are at the, at the heart of the control of more traditional communities, and they're very reluctant to loosen that control. Arab conservative circles, I object to Arab conservatism just as much as I object to Haredi conservatism. Note though, so for example, I object to the niqab. I think that the Bar-Ilan University decision to and not to allow the student to to wear a niqab is completely justified. Note though that political power makes a lot of difference with the impact that patriarchy has and the magnitude of the impact. So obviously, the magnitude of the impact of the patriarchal power of Haredi politicians is much more than the magnitude of the power of Arab patriarchal politicians. Although I think that this is a problem and that is a problem. But I talk about Haredi because they have much more power. Now I'll let Noya.
I'll be very brief to allow other people to respond. My comments were very brief, so I didn't have time to develop, and I'm not sure what exactly you found offending. And I meant that law is silencing internal debates within the ultra-Orthodox community. I wrote about it extensively, for instance, in my work of almost 15 years ago. I show in numbers that most ultra-Orthodox people did not actually objected to gender segregation in public transportation. I found the figures. People within the community did not want it. This move of moving to riding public transportation separately was promoted by extremist segments in the community, and law cooperated with it. Another example that I discuss in my writing is a group of feminist ultra-Orthodox women who fight to be members of the ultra-Orthodox parties in the Knesset, and I discuss how law does not enable it. I don't know why you shake your hand, but what I'm trying to say is that what I'm arguing is the ultra-Orthodox community does not speak in one voice, and we should see that there is an ongoing debate there about gender norms. And when law chooses and decide this is the position that we embrace, so the result is usually to undermine more moderate and liberal or modern voices within the community. So, yeah.
Maybe Daniel wants to.
No, we have a long.
Okay, so actually, I'm just relevant here, I think, in the sense that, first of all, I think that this is a great contribution. Seriously, we need this kind of book, and we need it now. And I think I agree with Noya that I think that this book should be read through the lenses of interweaving patrimony with other, as you note, other features of the rise of nationalism, the notion of a version of religiosity, which is not necessarily all versions of religiosity, but a version of religiosity. But I want to continue with Daniel's path in the sense that in defense of roles a little bit, to unlock a little bit from a different angle. So Rawls realized that there's a risk here that liberalism will be, analytically speaking, just like any other religion. So liberalism power, and this is Habermas's point, is linked to the notion of genuine deliberation. The idea that there has to be a sphere where the state and state laws do not govern from the perspective that Danielle was mentioned, like she said, brainwash, does not put the thumb on the scales to say these are the correct values. Because if the state does so, that anything that we generate is determined by what the state said is the orthodoxy, not religious orthodoxy, but the orthodoxy, and therefore liberalism loses a leg it stands on. Now this led Rawls to say, okay, he said, okay, we have to accommodate the non-liberals. I mean, he also had a more realistic concern. We can convince ourselves as liberals, but we have to live with the non-liberals as well. So how do we live? That's a pragmatic point. How do we live with those that don't agree with us? That's another point. But again, analytically speaking, or normatively speaking, we have to have a space whereby honest deliberation or genuine deliberation exists. Now, Noya says, well, the law should be careful because when the law says who speaks for those community and who speaks for that, the law inadvertently, or maybe advertently, puts the thumbs on the scale, and we should. So in a way, Noya's comments could be a quest for true liberalism, or more refined liberalism, in the sense of let's allow this honest deliberation. But if they choose that they prefer engendered schools, that's it. We have to accept this. If it's an honest decision of the religious community to adopt engendered school system, unless there is an overriding public interest that says, okay, then there's a slippery slope here. We will never be able to put any, and then everything will become segregated. This is Yofi Terosh's point that says there are no lines where you can draw. So if you allow this, everything will become segregated. In which case, I agree with that. I mean, so if she's right, then but if not, if we can't draw lines through spaces, then there has to be some notion of a genuinely private space, not as a source necessarily of subjugation, but as a source of free thought. Is it a place where we can genuinely articulate our values? And that's a challenge to liberalism. That means that we may get it wrong, and bad things may happen. But it has to be preserved somewhere, and I wonder whether what would you be your that's a classic liberal.
Okay, so first of all, I don't think I'm a non-liberal. I criticize liberalism the way it is today. I think it's another form of liberalism. I just want to remind you that Rawls himself said, and that's what I do in the last chapter. I show how Rawls's ideas just need to be reinterpreted. Rawls himself said that we should accommodate intolerance as long as it doesn't jeopardize liberal society. But when it does jeopardize liberal society, we should fight it like a plague.
That's right.
Okay, so we're there. What does it mean to fight it like a plague? Okay, so that's the only question. So I agree with you that there needs to be some space, but not the space we have today, not the space we had for the last 20, 30, 40 years. So now we need to renegotiate But we must understand that we need to renegotiate those. I don't know, maybe it's too late to renegotiate, but we need to renegotiate them not from not from the point of because what Rawls did is it was from a point of power. He felt that he, like liberals, there was a liberal hegemony, and we're the winners. So now let's be magnanimous to to all those illiberal, poor. Poor theories, poor communities that have lost. We're not there anymore, okay? And before we're completely reverse, find ourselves in a complete reverse situation, we need to quickly rethink. Now, the reason why why women's rights is the linchpin to all this is because women have never been there. That's something that that men don't understand. Even in liberal societies, women have always not been the winners, and they have not been the winners.
Jews, but that's
but they've not been the winners because of all these flaws in liberalism. So women are much more alert to the problem, and by analyzing women's rights, this is also why again everything. Women's rights is the linchpin on which all this revolution is taking place, and we need to recognize that, and we need to stop. You need to stop. Start thinking, what do you do on this? On the verge of of the going downhill.
Thank you, Gila, for this book. I haven't read it, but it seems very sophisticated. And I will go on from your last words. What do we have to do? Which is the most important question we are experiencing now, what is known as the backlash. The backlash is not happening only in Israel and in the US, but all over the world. I remember in Post Action, which is focusing on the backlash, very surprising in many liberal states in Europe. So I think that the focus on religion, or even the focus on nuances and innuendo of theory, political theory, or philosophical theory, in a way, it's not really misleading, but it's not really compatible with the nature of the fight that is happening now. And to say it very, very generally, we can see two camps, two parts of the society. Let's call them right and left. I mean, I know it's very simplistic, but just for the sake of going on. Now, trying to get into the possible interpretation of religion, as you do it bona fide, but I think in real reality, in real politics, things are not happening bona fide, because it is a struggle of keeping battles about keeping the power some group has and wants to keep the power. And it doesn't really matter what do you say about what the Torah says, or what exactly is the liberal Torah, and so on. It is a power balance struggle which has now reached a very crucial point. And we can see it, for example, with the strange alliances that are going on now, sometimes between very religious, ultra-Orthodox people and people which are not religious at all, like right-wings, secular people that somehow have much in common together because they are fighting for maintaining their power. So talking in this erudite discourse, it is perhaps using stones and sticks in a fight where the other side is using immunity
proposals and so on. I don't have a solution. I don't know what to do. But I think that this kind of discourse might be futile in the naked situation, brutal situation we are now facing. And of course, I agree with everything you say and everything that Nora said, but I think that I cannot find this sort of academic, perhaps, or scholarly discourse a way to go on and try to make things better. Sorry to sound so pessimistic.
No, it's okay. I'm more pessimistic than you, don't worry. No, but, I agree on the one hand, practically, but we feel very pessimistic, and still, I just came from a conference in the United States where somebody just said, some law professor report and said, because she was so upset with law schools and with law professors and whatever is going on in the United States, she said everybody needs to stop teaching law. There's no point in teaching law anymore. This is not a country in which there is law. And I told her, listen, look, Frankel's book about
the barbarians coming from the mountains.
No, it's not the barbarians coming from the mountain, but the contribution to the theory of dictatorship, or how does the dual state. There's always law, there's always theory, and people are, and there are always people who are who understand things through discussing law and theory, academics. That's what we do. This is our. If I wanted to, if I could, if I had, the ability, I don't, to become a politician, I would. Being a politician is much more, influential. But I can't be a politician. But I think there's a huge misunderstanding among liberals of what is going on. Who are genuinely committed to theory, to understanding why are we here, what happened to us, how is it that all our very lovely ideals of political liberalism and having everybody, why can't we all be friends? We can, feminism has always said that it's all about power. But what we've always said that, feminists, we always said that. It's not, but
liberalism is also about power.
Of course it is also about power, of course. But that doesn't
No, love is not.
But we're already beyond time, but we still have two questions, so maybe we'll collect them, and then, Adi and then.
Thank you. Thank you, Gila. I think the book is, I look forward to reading it because I just read the introduction. I have very brief questions. The first one is about causation. If we talk about the United States, which has a very long tradition of liberalism, it's hard for me to understand whether or not you attribute the rise of populism to liberalism, to liberal rights, or the lack of protection of women, because you do say that it happened, populism is a fairly new phenomena, right? In the past 2 decades, 3 decades, even if you want to take it backwards, we're talking about way longer tradition of liberalism. So that's just one point with causation. And then in terms of your normative solution, again, you don't really talk about that in the introduction. You take Turkey and the United States and Israel. I think that in Turkey, we saw a very different movement where the Turkish constitution was radically secular, and it completely pushed out any religious symptoms, and that did not stop or prevent Erdogan from rising to power. So it's a bit confusing to me, the Turkish example. And then if we go into, again, the normative element. I think that the problem, I would say, is about rights and liberal rights. Not only, again, liberal rights, the way they were developed was taking private rights that protected property, and then we go back to Martin Horowitz's piece on rights and the way that liberals actually took rights for the civil rights movement and kind of flipped them over their heads. And so the same thing is now happening with populism, where they take rights and flip it back to their ends and goals. So that's legitimate to me. What I think liberal movements should be doing is taking populist notions and flip them on their heads instead of keep insisting on rights and human rights, because as we see, and that goes into feminism, and we can talk about, you have Veal Goss's, which I think is an amazing piece about the way settlers are using human rights in the occupied territories. So I think that just keep pushing for rights and saying, no, we need more rights, and that's going to be the thing that saves us, to me, I think is the issue. So yeah, comments/questions, I guess.
Follow up the three last questions. You really focus on the US and Israel. It's very interesting, but the picture is much broader. And I wonder whether there is an analytical connection between the degree of democracy and the degree of populism in societies, if there is such a measure. Because you can think, Britain is a very high in democracy, but it's a very patriarchal society in many aspects. Italy might be much lesser a democracy, but things are much more complicated, and especially with regard to populism. You see, the head of the AfD in Germany is a woman. Marine Le Pen is a woman. So, I don't see the analytical connection between those two, besides, what you very interestingly surveyed in the US and Israel. So I wonder if there is a more general macro picture. So,
It's been a long day. Okay, so I'll try to take both together, because I think it also has to do with this question about possession. And she asked, how does Turkey even go into this? So, what I'm arguing is not that where there's democracy, there is no patriarchy, or the other way around, or there's no, I think there's democracy and patriarchy together, obviously. In the United States, in Israel, there's been democracy, but there's also been patriarchy. The idea is that patriarchy has always been there. The idea is that, liberals have allegedly tried to say, we push patriarchy into the private sphere, and thereby, in the public sphere, we're all equal, and thereby we are immune from from the results of patriarchy. Patriarchy doesn't hurt women; it's okay, and still we don't have any. Patriarchy doesn't, threaten liberal democracy because it agrees to be in the private sphere, and now all of a sudden it doesn't. And I think the connecting point is that all these right-wing populists and religious nationalists, because religious nationalism, it also goes to Shulamit's point, has a lot to do with this. All these people who are not really religious, but they want religious nationalism, they want a religious country because this is part of their identity. This makes them, this makes them feel special. Christian nationalism in the United States, sociologists say, is not only about religious people, it's also about people that are not very religious, but they want to see, because they're Christians, they're white, they're male, they want to see, the Christian white male in power. They don't want to see the connection, by the way, is, again, so I didn't do any empirical work, but those who did do empirical work, one of the connections that they point to is the advancement in equality for women. So equality for women, economic equality for women, if women get more equality, if women get more jobs, and men do not, all the incels, the males who incels in the United States, others in Europe,
blue collar working males who all of a sudden find themselves not to be the heads of family, not to be the ones who earn more, and they start being, feeling that all these liberal democratic ideas hurt them. And when those religious nationalists and when those right-wing populists offer to them a return to a patriarchal order in which they, by virtue of their maleness, their Christianity / Judaism, their whiteness / Judaism, they will be at the top. It's obviously extremely attractive, and it's even more attractive, the manosphere. These are all these things. The idea is that all these things have a similar, starting point, which is there was a social order, the patriarchal social order. This social order has been shaken, and now we see the backlash against this social order. But the backlash is not just with regard to women's rights, but it's with regard to all the liberal democratic order, which wasn't very good to women, okay? But it was much better to women than than what is on offer today. So this is the overall connection. And with regard to Turkey, I just want to say that Turkey is given as an example of a state that is going towards a patrimonial state. I don't have time. I wrote a whole article about this in Mishnah, as Ilan well knows. So you can read more about this there, but I don't have time to go into this because I think we're way past our time.
Thanks so much.